As golden sunlight bathed the royal estate, a frantic call shattered the morning calm. Inside a quiet corridor of Kensington Palace, Catherine's face drained of colour. She had just learned something no mother ever should. There was a potential threat, and it was coming from inside the palace walls. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It began with the quiet buzz of a secured line, an unexpected call from a private contact buried deep within the palace's internal security network. The voice on the other end was low, urgent, and deliberate. No names were spoken, only a single phrase repeated with chilling certainty: "There's movement inside. The breach is internal." At first, Catherine froze. Her fingers tightened around the edge of a nearby table, but that paralysis lasted only a moment. Her eyes shot across the hallway where George's laughter echoed faintly, oblivious to the storm forming around him. In that instant, instinct overruled decorum. She moved, swift and unwavering, toward her son. What had started as a routine morning unraveled into a silent crisis. Catherine's sudden command to palace staff to seal the family quarters sent waves of confusion through the otherwise composed household. Orders clashed with standard protocol. Security aides questioned, hesitated. But the Princess of Wales did not. She barged into George's room, pulled him close, and gave no explanation, only a look that silenced every question the young boy could have asked. George, still in his play clothes, sensed something was wrong, his wide eyes searching his mother's for reassurance that simply wasn't there. The internal breach warning was stamped with the highest clearance level: urgent internal breach. It wasn't foreign hackers or protesters at the gates. It was someone within their circle, someone who had knowledge of royal routines, access logs, and sensitive movements. Catherine's thoughts raced. Had she missed the signs? Was this linked to past anomalies that had been brushed aside? She remembered late-night footsteps near George's study room and flickering surveillance monitors dismissed as technical malfunctions. Now they all felt like unheeded warnings. As staff scrambled under uncharacteristically sharp instructions, the protocols meant to protect the royals began to collapse under the weight of doubt. Who could be trusted? Could security teams be fully relied upon if the threat was embedded among them? Catherine didn't wait to find out. She bypassed usual channels, communicating only with her most trusted aide and demanding immediate control over George's schedule. For a royal family built on tradition and order, her actions seemed almost rebellious, but to a mother, they were non-negotiable. And still, the air grew thicker with unease. The identity of the informant remained unknown. The warning had no attached dossier, no names, only the terrifying truth that the threat was real and it was near. As Catherine locked the doors and held George close, her mind spun through faces, memories, conversations, all with a single burning question: who would dare threaten the heir under her watch? But just as Catherine clutches George in her arms, a face from the shadows emerges, one she never expected to suspect. The royal family has always known secrets live in the cracks of history, but this time, whispers travelled fast. Behind closed drawing-room doors, someone was leaking confidential details about Prince George's private schedule. The enemy wasn't a stranger, it was someone who knew the palace's rhythms intimately. Within 24 hours of Catherine's initial alarm, deeper fractures began to appear. Surveillance teams reported intermittent camera outages near George's quarters, just a few seconds here, a minute there. At first they were dismissed as technical interference, but as Catherine cross-checked access logs, she discovered disturbing inconsistencies: staff movements unrecorded, doors opened without card entries, and timestamps that didn't align. These weren't accidents. Someone was deliberately manipulating the system from within, and they were getting bolder. That same evening, a senior lady-in-waiting, one who had served during the Queen's final years, was found loitering near George's study under the guise of delivering correspondence. When questioned, her explanation faltered. Her answers were vague. It was George's private tutor who flagged the moment. She hadn't seen the woman enter, but she saw her retreat quietly, nervously, like someone who knew she had overstepped. Catherine, already fraying at the edges, demanded answers, but was instead met with polite indifference and passive deflection. That's when she knew the rot was deeper than anyone had imagined. Days later, leaked documents surfaced copies of George's updated school route, maps marked with highlighted paths, alternative exits circled in red. These weren't idle curiosities. They were tactical documents, the kind reserved for internal security briefings. Someone had access to the plans and had either passed them on or intended to. For Catherine, this wasn't just a breach of trust. It was an existential threat. She had held her silence long enough. She summoned William quietly, without alerting advisors or protocol teams. When he arrived, she showed him the folder of leaked papers, the security log inconsistencies, and the flagged access points. His expression didn't change, but his silence was damning. For the first time in years, they both realized how vulnerable their father, Millie, truly was, and how utterly unprepared the palace remained for an attack from within. There were no raised voices, no panic, only resolve. Something had to be done, and fast. But the real blow came when Catherine confronted a long-time royal aide, a woman she had trusted since George's christening. She chose her words carefully, but the betrayal was clear. The aide, once calm and confident, now looked rattled. Catherine pressed harder. The aide denied everything, but her hands trembled, her eyes darted, and then she said something that chilled Catherine to her core. "I was only following instructions." Whose instructions she never clarified. That night, another message arrived. A simple note left at Catherine's bedside. No envelope, no signature. Just 7 words scribbled hastily across the center. "This is bigger than you think. Watch George." It was no longer just about documents or schedules or whispers. It was about George himself. Terrified but determined, Catherine makes a desperate choice to isolate her son, but the palace has eyes everywhere. It was hidden inside a locked drawer in Charles's old study, a red folder marked Archive, Restricted. What Catherine found inside changed everything. Pages of internal surveillance summaries, coded notes, and one file that sent a chill down her spine. O.P. George. She had slipped in under the guise of a late-night consult with a royal archivist, but Catherine had no intention of browsing history books. Every step toward that drawer was driven by growing dread. Too many things weren't adding up: security gaps, vanishing documents, and now the message warning her to watch George. She had trusted people, processes, even the royal systems themselves. But now, with her son's safety in question, she wasn't looking for reassurance. She was looking for evidence. The key to the drawer had been tucked behind a hidden frame, one she remembered, Charles always guarding but never referencing. What lay inside would unravel the threads of her already fragile trust. The red folder was thick, heavier than expected, stamped with 3 seals and initialed personally by the late Queen Elizabeth II. Inside were documents labelled with dates going back nearly a decade, marked under a single chilling heading: Operation George. At first glance, it seemed like a mere risk analysis protocols, projected timelines, legacy planning. But the deeper she read, the clearer it became. This wasn't strategic preparation, it was surveillance. Internal memos spoke of monitoring proximity influencers, limiting exposure to ideological contamination, and ensuring conformity with pre-approved behavioral expectations. Catherine's hands trembled. These weren't about protecting George. They were about controlling him. 2 incidents stood out, one involving a broken classroom window in 2017 that was dismissed as a construction error. Another, a car veering too close during a walkabout in 2019. Both had been formally closed without inquiry. Yet these documents revealed internal concern code phrases like deliberate contact trial and unsanctioned testing. These weren't random events. They were markers, experiments, dry runs. But who had ordered them? That's when she noticed it: pages and pages redacted, names blacked out. But one name remained untouched. Lord H. She paused. That name had long since faded from the palace spottle. Ait, a former statesman, once part of a shadow advisory board during the Queen's waning years. Officially retired. Unofficially his reach, it seemed, had never ended. And it wasn't just Lord H. A coded logbook noted multiple interventions taken in alignment with precedent, which meant Catherine wasn't the first. Someone, perhaps even Diana, may have faced these same battles. Someone else had tried to shield their child from the monarchy's hidden machinery and failed. Now it was her turn, but Catherine wasn't going to fail. Not this time. Not with George. She closed the folder, heart pounding with the weight of generations pressing against her chest. It wasn't only about motherhood anymore, it was about legacy, power, and resistance. And if there was one person in the entire royal house who might know the truth behind this, it was the only royal who had ever publicly challenged the institution's inner workings. With danger lurking and time slipping away, Catherine must face the one royal figure who may know the truth, Princess Anne. Princess Anne doesn't startle easily, but when Catherine laid the red folder on the table, Anne's hands trembled. With a heavy sigh, she looked into Catherine's eyes and said, "Your son is the future, but someone in this family sees him as a threat." The room fell into a thick, uneasy quiet as Anne stared at the document before her. It was the first time Catherine had ever seen the Princess Royal hesitate, her typically iron gaze now shadowed with something unspoken. There were few people Catherine trusted in the institution, but Anne had long stood apart from the inner circles, respected for her forthright manner and historical distance from lace, politics. Catherine had hoped Anne might have answers, but nothing could have prepared her for what she was about to hear. With a tired breath, Anne gestured for privacy and poured them both a cup of tea, a quiet ritual that felt more like a funeral rite than afternoon comfort. When she finally spoke, it was with a tone laced with cold realism. They started watching George the moment he was born. It's not protection, it's containment. You've seen it now. So did I. Catherine's pulse quickened as Anne recounted her own years of quiet rebellion, how she had shielded Zara and Peter from the crown's suffocating grip. Anne confessed that she had resisted palace expectations, refused certain titles, and moved decisively to keep her children away from the machine that consumed heirs and twisted bloodlines into symbols. But there was more, a deeper layer. Anne then leaned in and, in a voice almost too soft to hear, revealed that during William's formative years, there had been efforts covert, orchestrated to subtly sabotage his public image. Rumours planted, moments manipulated, a campaign cloaked in tradition but rooted in power plays. And now, Anne feared, that same strategy was being sharpened once again, this time with George in the crosshairs. There was pain in Anne's voice, not theatrical, but forged from experience. Catherine listened in disbelief, as Anne described an undercurrent of resentment that had simmered for decades. The institution was not united, she explained. It was layered with rivalries, territorial pride, and lingering tensions over succession. Those who believed they had been overlooked or undercut in the royal hierarchy had not forgotten, and for them, George represented both a clean future and a reminder of their own irrelevance. He was a symbol of tomorrow, and in the eyes of some, that made him dangerous. Anne paused and fixed Catherine with a warning so sharp it pierced through her composure. Don't underestimate those closest to you. They hold the sharpest daggers. It wasn't paranoia, it was a lived truth. A truth passed from one royal mother to another. Catherine sat still, every word sinking deeper than the last. She had entered the room searching for facts. She left carrying a burden no mother should bear, an awareness that her son's innocence stood in direct conflict with the ambitions of others, some of whom wore the same crest and dined at the same table. Fueled by fear and maternal instinct, Catherine hatches a bold plan to take control of George's security herself, but she'll need allies. Beneath the stone corridors of St. James's Palace, a clandestine meeting unfolds. Catherine, cloaked and resolute, assembles a hand-picked circle, old guards, loyal aides, and one ex-MI5 advisor. Their mission? Stop the insider threat before it reaches her son. This wasn't a council of courtiers or ceremony. It was a war room disguised by whispers. Catherine had chosen each person carefully, some from the fringes of the royal household, others who had served the family with discretion and loyalty, but were long believed to be out of commission. The most crucial of them had been suggested quietly by Princess Alexandra, a former intelligence officer with deep ties to British security agencies and a history of handling royal protection matters during turbulent years. He was the kind of man who operated in silence and shadows, whose presence alone meant the threat was not only real but escalating. Catherine didn't need tradition. She needed results. The meeting cracked open secrets buried for generations. Hidden beneath ceremonial language and dusty archives were protocols untouched since Queen Victoria's reign. Obscure mechanisms designed for emergency protection of royal heirs, emergency codes, covert shelter routes, contingency relocation plans. They'd been archived as relics of a different era, but Catherine saw in them the tools she needed to protect George now. With her authority, and bolstered by William's quiet consent, she reactivated these procedures under a new name, Operation Shield. Its purpose was simple: control proximity, track exposure, eliminate infiltration. Within days, tracking patterns around George's private areas revealed inconsistencies. A royal aide's name popped up on security access logs that didn't match their assigned duties. A staff member was seen lingering outside George's study, with no clear reason. But the true jolt came when Catherine's private aide noticed a new electronic toy in George's room, one she had no recollection of approving. Upon closer inspection, it contained a discreet listening device, one not visible to the naked eye. A child's toy, weaponized as a surveillance node. Catherine was livid, not at the object but at what it symbolized. Someone had breached her son's sacred space, turned innocence into exposure. In confidential review sessions, one name kept surfacing in connection with security staff transitions and communication reroutes. A quiet but influential figure tied to Queen Camilla's private advisory circle. The link wasn't overt, it was more insidious. Catherine felt the threads tightening around her trusted connections, fraying, familiar faces suddenly becoming blurred silhouettes of doubt. Her composure cracked one evening as she stood over George's crib, hands shaking. Her voice broke not with fear, but defiance. "They will not take him," she whispered. "Not this time. Not like they did before. But just as progress is made, a critical betrayal sends shockwaves through the secret team and George vanishes for over an hour." The cameras froze. The guards didn't see. And George, gone. For 60 minutes the palace descended into a quiet chaos, hushed orders echoing through the halls. Catherine's worst nightmare had become a reality, and someone inside made it happen. It began as a minor technical error, or so the system logs claimed. A temporary surveillance blackout, attributed to a server update that no one had scheduled. Just 60 minutes missing. 1 solid hour of George's whereabouts unaccounted for. At first, staff whispered about a malfunction. But Catherine knew better. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a strike. Cold, calculated, and chillingly efficient. The last confirmed sighting placed George near his private tutoring room, a part of the palace rarely accessed without clearance, and dangerously close to an old, unmonitored corridor that had been unused since the Queen Mother's time. That section had been flagged weeks prior during Operation Shield as a structural vulnerability. Now it had become the center of a storm. Catherine's panic was immediate and unfiltered. Orders flew from her lips, overriding staff hesitation. Doors slammed, lines were jammed, the entire palace slipped into an unprecedented lockdown, one not seen even during national emergencies. Her composure cracked in ways no protocol could contain. Every second stretched endlessly as she barked commands, cross-checked names, and tore through the maze of corridors herself, refusing to stand still. She wasn't the Princess of Wales in that moment. She was a mother stripped of ceremony, clawing through the marble silence for any sign of her son. When William arrived, the air thickened with fury. He had been attending a closed royal engagement off-site and returned to confusion, panic, and complete disorder. His voice, usually tempered even under pressure, rose with unmistakable rage as he demanded to know why the royal protocols had failed, why the crisis team hadn't responded faster, and how such a catastrophic breach could occur under their watch. He turned to Catherine not in blame, but in desperation, and together they realized that their family was no longer merely under scrutiny. It was under siege. Then, like a whisper against a scream, word came through. George had been found, safe, alone in the old chapel tucked between the east wing and the archives, a place he had never been taken before, a place he could not have known existed. When questioned, his temporary guardian, a long-standing member of the household staff, claimed George had simply asked for quiet, and they obliged, unaware of the turmoil erupting around them. But it was the guardian's next sentence that sent a chill down Catherine's spine. He asked me if I could take him to the room where the stars live. A nickname only Catherine and William used for George's nursery, the one filled with glow-in-the-dark constellations. That phrase had never been shared publicly, nor used around staff. It was private, personal, protected. Now Catherine knows the infiltrator is closer than ever. She turns her attention toward the Royal Council. And Camilla stood poised in the council chamber, but her composure fractured when Catherine stormed in. The room fell silent as accusations flew. Catherine demanded answers, and for once the Queen Consort was left speechless. It wasn't protocol, it wasn't polite. But Catherine was done playing the game by rules written to protect those already in power. She entered the room not as a duchess with deference, but as a mother with fury. In her hand was the evidence, file after file detailing access breaches, movement logs, and a damning communication trail that led back to an aide who had once served quietly under Camilla's personal watch. The tone in the chamber shifted instantly. The Queen Consort, flanked by loyal advisers, tried to maintain her usual calm, but the edge in Catherine's voice was impossible to ignore. Her words weren't vague, they were surgical. She laid down the documents on the table, one by one, exposing the cracks in a palace that had for too long relied on silence. Camilla's initial response was dismissal. She waved away the evidence, called it coincidence, an overreaction, perhaps even paranoia. But before her protest could carry weight, another voice cut through the room, steady, authoritative, and unapologetic. Princess Anne. She stepped forward and placed her hand beside Catherine's. She's not wrong, Anne said. Her words carrying decades of weight. And you know it. The chamber, suddenly breathless, turned toward the eldest royal with stunned hesitation. Anne's siding with Catherine wasn't just unexpected, it was unprecedented. And it changed everything. The divide became visible. Charles, seated near the head of the table, looked between the two women, his wife and his daughter-in-law, with something between disbelief and helplessness. William, already standing near the door, took a step forward and stared at his father, unblinking. For years they had kept peace for the sake of optics, for the sake of tradition. But this time, something deeper was at stake. Reputations were no longer protected behind closed doors. They were being dissected piece by piece in front of witnesses. Royal advisers scrambled, some trying to defuse the situation, others retreating into damage control mode. Names were whispered, timelines questioned, but one thread stood out with a precision too damning to ignore. A former aide to Prince Andrew, quietly dismissed after his public disgrace. This aide had re-emerged, buried within Camilla's advisory circle, under a new title and role. His name was now tied to multiple unexplained movements near George's quarters. His access quietly restored by special approval only a senior royal could authorize. The web was no longer theoretical. It was tangible. And Camilla, for all her denials, had no response when asked how that approval came to pass. But while the palace erupts in a battle of reputations, Catherine realizes something chilling. This may have never been about George, but what George represents, the monarchy thrives on order, tradition, and control. But George represents a new era, an unpredictable future. Behind every threat lies fear of what his reign might undo, and Catherine, now fully aware, sees the threat wasn't just to her son but to the very future of the monarchy. For days, Catherine had moved like someone seeing ghosts, haunted not by fantasy, but by clarity. Every encounter, every icy glance in council, every hollow gesture at formal events now revealed its double meaning. She began to trace a pattern not just of opposition, but of ideological warfare. This wasn't a battle about power. It was about preservation, because George, in his innocence, symbolized change, a royal child born into a world more awake, more skeptical, more connected. a child destined to question, not simply inherit. For those who had benefited from silence and lineage, that posed a far greater danger than scandal ever could. Catherine's thoughts turned to history, generations of royal heirs pushed, pulled, and shaped to fit the mold of stability. She saw echoes of Charles's suppressed early visions, of William's own struggles to modernize within rigid tradition, and even of Princess Diana's silent battles against protocol. But George? He could be different. Not because of the crown, but because of what his mother had now vowed to protect: his identity, his voice, and above all, his freedom to become more than just a symbol. So she began to quietly rebuild. Not a fortress of steel, but a framework of intention. A new structure around George's upbringing, discreet but deliberate. Certain elements of his education were pulled away from palace control. Tutors were vetted under personal oversight. His exposure to public duties was re-evaluated and scaled back, not out of fear, but out of strategy. He would not be a pawn. He would not be absorbed into a machine designed to silence nuance. The trust she placed was limited, the circle smaller than ever. And yet, within that constraint, Catherine found power. In a final private conversation with William, the weight of everything they had endured came to a head. They stood not as heirs or royals, but as parents stripped bare by truth. "We build a wall now," Catherine told him, voice steady but solemn. Not of stone, but trust. It was more than a declaration, it was a reckoning. Because they both knew the threat was no longer a singular person, but a mindset deeply embedded within the palace's very foundations. And that mindset would not go quietly. But just when Catherine feels secure, an anonymous letter is delivered, and it's signed with a royal seal from a name long thought irrelevant. In her private quarters, Catherine opened the letter under dim candlelight. The handwriting was unmistakable. It warned of another plan already in motion, one that not even the king himself had knowledge of. And at the center of it was George. The envelope was sealed with a crest no longer in active use, a symbol once attached to a branch of the monarchy that had faded from public view. The paper carried the weight of time, but the message was sharp and immediate. What Catherine read was not a threat, it was a revelation. An anonymous voice spoke with the confidence of insider knowledge, referencing an ancient and deliberately obscured alliance, an unspoken circle of royals and former palace operatives, whose sole purpose was to preserve the crown at any cost. Not preserve the monarchy, not preserve the family, the crown, power itself. And that distinction made everything Catherine had fought for feel suddenly more fragile than ever. George was never simply a child in their eyes. He was a symbol, a turning point, a threat to the very architecture that had maintained their relevance. His kindness, his curiosity, his disarming honesty, traits the public adored, were seen behind closed doors as unpredictability. He didn't yet understand how to stay silent, how to bend to optics, how to bury discomfort beneath tradition. And that made him dangerous. This hidden circle, rooted in decades-old agreements and silence, had once targeted other royals, quietly subtle relocations, image manipulation, sudden health retreats masked as holidays. But this time, their plan had changed. Catherine, through her defiance, had accelerated their timeline. And now George wasn't just watched, he was marked. The letter outlined fragments of a strategy already in motion. A redirection of George's narrative. A quiet campaign to dilute his influence before it could fully take shape. Controlled engagements, altered schooling, even soft character assessments quietly passed to the press under the guise of insider sources. Catherine felt the room close in, not from fear but from resolve. This wasn't just a fight to protect her son anymore, it was a reckoning with the entire system she had once believed she could adapt within. The reality was clearer than ever, she had to change it from the inside, or watch it swallow him whole. She sat beside George's bed that night longer than usual, watching the rise and fall of his breath. In his sleep, he mumbled a phrase she barely caught, something about stars and castles. He was still dreaming, still innocent. But Catherine wasn't. She was awake now, permanently. And when he woke, she would begin again. Not with fear, but with purpose. As dawn crept over the palace, she took his hand and walked him to the grand windows overlooking Buckingham Palace. In silence, they looked out across the grounds, the towers, the gilded lies, and in her mind a voice echoed not hers, but the truth she had come to embody. You don't just marry into power, you defend it. Every day, as the palace slumbers beneath its glittering chandeliers, Catherine remains awake, guarding the heir to a kingdom trembling beneath its own weight. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.